The overwhelming success of the Allied armies in the greatest of all wars was based on many factors, but primarily the achievement of the GIs.
I have the proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. They have pushed triumphantly forward over the hundreds of miles, separating Cherbourg from Lübeck, Munich, and Leipzig. Merely to name my principal supporters in the Canadian, French, American, and British forces is to present a picture of the utmost in efficiency, skill, loyalty, and devotion to duty. The United Nations will gratefully remember Tedder, Montgomery, Spotts, Bradley, Milot, Freer, and many others. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges in the desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
In June 1945, General Eisenhower returned to the United States by government order to participate in a series of celebrations throughout the country for victorious American troops from the European theater. America greeted its heroes with wild acclaim in a stirring tribute to the men who had won the victory.
The first and most enduring lesson of the Mediterranean and European campaigns was the proof that war can be waged effectively by a coalition of nations. Historic difficulties had been overcome, and the grave doubts that had existed on this point had been completely dispelled. Governments and their subsidiary economic, political, and military organizations had combined into one great effort in which no major difficulty could be traced to diverging national interests. Allied effectiveness in World War II established for all time the feasibility of developing and employing joint control machinery that can meet the sternest tests of war. The key to the matter is a readiness on highest levels to adjust all nationalistic differences that affect the strategic employment of combined resources, and in the war theater, to designate a single commander who is supported to the limit. With these two things done, success rests in the vision, the leadership, the skill, and the judgment of the professionals making up command and staff groups. In World War II, America and Great Britain understood and applied these truths. Foremost among the military lessons was the extraordinary and growing influence of the airplane in the waging of war. The European campaign almost daily developed new and valuable uses for air power. Its effect in the weakening of German capacity was decisively felt on both the eastern and western fronts. Beyond this, the airplane was a valuable logistics agent, particularly during our speedy dashes across France and later across Germany. Without it, those pursuits could never have proceeded with such speed, nor could they have accomplished such remarkable results. The combination of an overwhelming air force and the great mobility of ground forces enabled us to strike any chosen point along a front of hundreds of miles. Our experiences had reaffirmed the truth that unity, coordination, and cooperation are the keys to successful operations. War is waged in three elements: that there is no separate land, air, or naval war. Unless all assets in all elements are efficiently combined and coordinated against a properly selected common objective, their maximum potential power cannot be realized. Physical targets may be separated by the breadth of a continent or an ocean, but their destruction must contribute in maximum degree to the furtherance of the combined plan of operation. That is what coordination means. We re-examined the role of the fundamental agent in military success, the individual soldier. A trained American possesses qualities that are almost unique. Because of his initiative and resourcefulness, his adaptability to change, and his readiness to resort to expedient, he becomes, when he has attained a proficiency in all the normal techniques of battle, a most formidable soldier. Veteran organizations are normally more capable than those entering battle. They do become more skillful in the utilization of every advantage offered by firepower, maneuver, and terrain. They acquire a steadiness that is not shaken by the confusion and destruction of battle. Early in the war, it became evident that the emotional stamina and spiritual strength of the individual soldier were as important in battle success as his weapons and training. In any kind of warfare, troop morale is a decisive factor. The campaigns in the Mediterranean and in Europe had no prior parallel in the history of warfare. Throughout them, the United States Army had engaged in operations without comparable precedent since its establishment in 1775. For the operations in Africa and Europe, there had been involved the organization of a vast ground force, built around 47 infantry divisions and their artillery. Some divisions bore far more than their share of combat. The 34th, 45th, 3rd, and 1st Divisions led in the number of days in battle, with total days in combat between 438 and more than 500. No pre-war definition of the Army's mission could adequately have forecast the scope or ramifications of its job against the European Axis. Victory in the Mediterranean and European campaigns gave the lie to all who preached or shall preach that the democracies are decadent, afraid to fight, unable to match the productivity of regimented economies, unwilling to sacrifice in a common cause. In dozens of ways, scientists and inventors transformed the face of war. Early in July, I learned that there would be a test in New Mexico of the atomic bomb, which American scientists had finally succeeded in developing. At the time, I expressed the hope that we would never have to use such a thing against any enemy, because I disliked seeing the United States take the lead in introducing into the war something as horrible and destructive as this new weapon was described to be. I did not then know, of course, that an army of scientists had been engaged in the production of the weapon and that secrecy in this vital matter could not have been maintained indefinitely.
But in July 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico, the most critical experiment in centuries was shrouded in secrecy.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert. And I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
But in 40 seconds, we'll know.
Only such leading atomic scientists as Dr. Vannevar Bush, Harvard President James Bryant Conant, and a few top government officials knew what was about to happen.
Minus 10 seconds. Minus 5 seconds. Now!
All the developments in method, equipment, and destructive power that we were studying seemed minor innovations compared to the revolutionary impact of the atom bomb. The reports that reached us after the first one was used against the enemy at Hiroshima on August 6th left no doubt in our minds that a new era of warfare had begun. In an instant, many of the old concepts of war were swept away. Henceforth, it would seem, the purpose of an aggressor nation would be to stock atom bombs in quantity and to employ them by surprise against the industrial fabric and population centers of its intended victims. Even the bombed ruins of Germany suddenly seemed to provide but faint warning of what future war could mean to the people of the earth. But on all sides, there was evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Germany's bridges were down, her cities in ruins, and her great industrial capacity practically paralyzed. Between September 1939 and May 1945, millions of Europeans had been killed and many millions more left homeless. In Germany itself, after years of seeming invincibility, a carpet of destruction and desolation had spread over the land. Of all the distressing memories that will forever live with American veterans of the war in Europe, none will be sharper or more enduring than those of the DPs, the truly unfortunate, who, for one reason or another, no longer had homes or were persecutees who dare not return home for fear of further persecution. Volumes have been, and more volumes will be written, on the collapse of world cooperation and the true significance of the events that accompanied the tragedy. I felt and hoped that the lessons which 6 years of unremitting war had brought to the world would convince everyone everywhere that the employment of force in the international field should of necessity be abjured. With the evidence of the most destructive war yet waged by the people of the earth about me, I gained increased hope that this development of what appeared to be the ultimate in destruction would drive men in self-preservation to find a way of eliminating war. Maybe it is only wishful thinking to believe that fear, universal fear, might possibly succeed where statesmanship and religion had not yet won success.
The first major post-war problem for the Allies in Europe was the administration of conquered Germany, a task which demanded ready cooperation and mutual confidence among the victors.
From the record of Russian contacts with the Western Allies during the war, we believed in the early summer of 1945 that success in joint government of Germany would be measured almost exclusively by the degree to which the Western Allies, both generally and locally, overcame Russian suspicion and distrust. There was a vast gulf to be bridged between governmental systems.
For all the peoples of the world, 1945 was a most critical year. A month before the end of the war in Europe, free people in all parts of the globe were stunned by a tragic loss.
The day of April 12th ended on a note of dramatic climax when we heard the news of President Roosevelt's death. We pondered over the effect the president's death might have upon the future peace.
25 years ago, American fighting men looked to the statesmen of the world to furnish the work of peace for which they fought and suffered. We failed them. We failed them then. We cannot fail them again. and expect the world to survive again.
If all nations were willing to pool partial authority in a single headquarters with power to enforce their decisions, international unity could be attained. In the formation of the United Nations, however, this lesson had not yet been accepted. The compelling necessities of the moment leave us no alternative to the maintenance of real and respectable strength, not only in our moral rectitude and our economic power, but in terms of adequate military preparedness. To neglect this, pending universal resurgence of a definite spirit of cooperation, is not only foolish, it is criminally stupid. Thorough technical, psychological, and physical training is one protection and one weapon that every nation can give to its soldiers before committing them to battle. But since war always comes to a democracy as an unexpected emergency, this training must be largely accomplished in peace. Until world order is an accomplished fact and universal disarmament a logical result, it will always be a crime to excuse men from the types and kinds of training that will give them a decent chance for survival in battle. The lessons of 1914 and 1939 remain valid so long as the world has not learned the futility of making competitive force the final arbiter of human questions.
Leary Valley lies in the Italian Midland, some 60 miles northwest of Naples to some 40 miles southeast of Rome. A wide, flat corridor enclosed between four walls of mountains. In winter, the highest peaks of the Leary Range ascend into the snows, but the valley floor with its olive groves and ancient vines, its crops of wheat and corn, is green the year around. That is, in normal times. Last year was a bad year for grapes and olives, and the fall planting was late. Many fields lay fallow. There are two ways from the south into the valley. One, a narrow path. The other, a high, scenic road over the mountains. They converge before the site of the ancient village of San Pietro, which for 700 years has stood at the threshold of Leary Valley, welcoming the traveler. The stones of its walls were quarried out of the parent hill from whose slopes it rises. Population 1,412 at the last census, a farming community. Patron St. Peter. Point of interest, St. Peter's, 1438. Note interesting treatment of chancel. As St. Peter's was erected by those who were to worship there, so each original dwelling was built by the ones who were to live there. And this practice has endured down through the centuries. The Italian peasant is a born mason. He cuts and lays and mortars in the stone with great skill and patience, building not for himself alone, but for future generations. From the end of October 1943 until the middle of December, San Pietro and the surrounding ground was the scene of some of the bitterest fighting on our Fifth Army front. The Italian campaign had entered its second phase, to push forward again after a static period brought on by heavy seasonal rain. Our battle lines were haphazard as the terrain itself, with its blood-swollen rivers that twisted back and forth across our line of march, so that each river seemed like five, and where there was no river to cross, a mountain blocked our going. Each peak ahead being a few meters higher than the last we had won, so that each new peak had to be fought for the hard, uphill way, with the enemy looking down our throats. They had had time to fortify and camouflage their positions. No amount of artillery fire or aerial bombardment could force them to withdraw. That was for the infantry to do, employing those weapons to confine and destroy life in narrow trenches, caves, and fighting holes. It was up to the man with the rifle, the man under fire from all weapons, the man whose way all our weapons, land, air, and sea, serve only to prepare. It was up to the foot soldier to attack a hidden enemy over ground that was sown with mines, the anti-personnel S-mines that fly up at a football to explode beneath the groin. Nowhere along the entire front were enemy preparations more elaborate than in the San Pietro area. For San Pietro stands at the threshold of Liri Valley, and through Liri Valley, wide and level, runs the most highly prized length of road south of Rome. By early December, we had taken and were holding high ground to the northeast, east, and south of San Pietro, the Camino Maggiore hill mass being last to fall. Italian troops under Allied command had made a vain attempt to capture Mount Lungo, possession of which would have acted greatly to our benefit in the impending action. But so excessive were the losses on Mount Lungo that further operations against its strategic heights were deemed unwarranted. It was thereon determined to make a direct frontal assault on enemy positions around and within the San Pietro. Battalions of the 36th Texas Infantry Division were rotated from position to position overlooking the valley, so the troops might study the terrain ahead from various viewpoints. Patrol activity was continuous. Day and night, units went out to reconnoiter the ground, draw fire, take prisoners, thus adding to the sum of our information about the enemy. High points, Mount Lungo's 351 and Mount Samucro's 1205 and 950 were all manned in force. The town itself was strongly garrisoned with numerous mortar, machine gun, and heavy weapon emplacements. 4 enemy battalions were dug into a line of connecting trenches and mutually supporting pillboxes in depth that extended from the base of Mount Lungo, northeast across the valley floor to the base of Mount Samucro. Another battalion was organized to defend the high ground northwest of San Pietro. Areas before these positions were heavily mined and held a confusion of barbed wire and booby traps. On the afternoon before, D-Day and H-Hour were communicated to battalion commanders. December 8th, at 0620 hours, the 1st Battalion of the 143rd Infantry Regiment to attack the summit of 1205, having moved up the mountain under cover of darkness, and upon achieving its objective to attack along the ridge to a point northwest of San Pietro. The 3rd Ranger Battalion likewise to attack 950, another feature of the Mount Samucro hill mass. The 2nd Battalion of the 143rd to attack over the terraced olive orchards northeast of San Pietro. The 3rd Battalion acting in support to follow the 2nd at 400 yards. Of the original force to establish the beachhead at Salerno, the 143rd had since spent all but a fortnight in action under extremely bitter weather conditions. At Salerno, at the Volturno crossing, it had taken mortal punishment. The task ahead promised no less bloodshed, yet it was undertaken in good spirits and high confidence. The 1st Battalion began the long, rugged climb up Mount Sammucra. As night fell, our artillery opened up, and throughout the night hours, intense fire was laid down on the enemy's main line of resistance. It had rained most of the night, and it was raining at each hour until 2nd and 3rd Battalions crossed the line of departure. Some 200 yards forward, they encountered wires, mines, and automatic fire from pillboxes. Mortar and artillery were deadly accurate by reason of excellent enemy observation from Mount Lungo, overlooking our advance, which continued another 200 to 400 yards. Many men gave their lives in attempts to jump the wire, reach pillboxes, and throw hand grenades through the narrow gun openings. The 3rd Battalion was committed. The advance never got more than 600 yards past the line of departure. Our initial assault on San Pietro had been repulsed with heavy casualties. The attack on Hill 1205, however, was a brilliant success. Leading leading elements of the 1st Battalion had gained the summit of the objective before a strongly entrenched enemy knew that an assault was in progress. To the right of 1205, the 3rd Ranger Battalion had also captured its objective, but only after successive attacks and costly casualties. For on Hill 950, the enemy was not taken unaware. Counterattacks were to be expected on both 1205 and 950. They were not long developing. During the early daylight hours, and even as it was beaten off, another took form. Day and night they followed in unremitting violence. The toll of enemy dead mounted with each new attempt. The German prisoners captured on 1205 and 950 said that they had been ordered to retake those positions at all costs. Acting in excellent cooperation, the artillery's supporting power disrupted numerous enemy counterattacks while they were in the process of being formed. In addition to defending Hill 1205, the 1st Battalion, obedient to the field order, undertook the reduction of enemy defenses which were organized along the ridge running west. December, the 1st Battalion was reinforced with the 504th Parachute Battalion, which took over and maintained the defenses of 1205 and 950, thereby enabling the 1st Battalion to throw its entire remaining strength into the assault along the ridge. But the 1st strength had dwindled and shrunk in the 5 days past, and there was now a question as to whether its existing numbers were sufficient to prevail. Reports during the night of the 14th of December stated that the enemy was offering bitter resistance and that the issue was in grave doubt. Meanwhile, on the olive terraces below, the 2nd and 3rd Battalion had twice again attempted to reach their objective. Both times they had come up against a wall of automatic weapon, mortar, and artillery fire. Volunteer patrols made desperate attempts to reach enemy positions and reduce strong points. Not a single member of any such patrol ever came back alive. Our attacking forces were furnished excellent aerial cover by Allied fighter patrols. but now and then enemy planes were able to slip through and to bomb and strafe our position, which to all purposes had remained unchanged since the first day. To break the deadlock, orders were given for a coordinated divisional attack. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 143rd to proceed in the execution of the original orders. Acting in conjunction, Company A of the 753rd Tank Battalion to attack San Pietro from the east over the high road. 1 battalion of the 141st to attack over the flat valley floor. After nightfall on D-Day, the 142nd Infantry Regiment to attack the heights of Mount Lungo. In preparation for the attack, all 5th Army artillery within range, including tanks and all tracks, was directed against San Pietro and the surrounding area. Hour, 1200 hours. D-Day, the 15th of December. The 141st Infantry advanced some 400 yards from its line of departure, to be borne down and held powerless under the weight of enemy fire. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 143rd advanced some 100 yards beyond their former positions to a point almost directly before forward enemy defenses. And for the 3rd time, they were forced to take such cover as the quaking earth could offer. And the tanks. Orders were for them to enter the town and to locate and destroy the heavy weapons there, which were leveled against our attacking foot soldiers. The high road into San Pietro was a narrow mountain road, and from the beginning of its winding descent into Liri Valley, it was under direct enemy observation. Tanks started down that road. Three reached the outskirts of the town. Of these, 2 were destroyed and 1 was missing. 5 tanks were immobilized behind enemy lines, their crews having to abandon them. 5 tanks hit mines within our lines and were thereupon destroyed by enemy gunfire. 4 tanks returned to the bivouac area. After dark, 2 companies, 1 from the 2nd Battalion and 1 from the 3rd, finally succeeded in penetrating enemy positions before San Pietro. But receiving both frontal and flanking fire, they were forced to retire. Company E having been reduced in strength to 8 riflemen, and Company L faring little better. On the Mount Samocro Ridge, the 1st Battalion fought its way to within a few hundred yards of the objective. But it had paid for ground gained at the rate of a man a yard, and it did not have strength to carry the fight any further forward. On Mount Lungo, however, despite bitter resistance, battalions of the 142nd in successive waves kept pushing upward. Until in the early daylight hours of the 16th of December, its foot soldiers had gained the summit and were wiping up what remained of a stubborn enemy. And that height proved to be a key position in the enemy plan of defense. For even as Mount Lungo fell, the enemy throughout the San Pietro area made preparations to withdraw. Almost invariably, the enemy will counterattack to cover the withdrawal. The first violent thrust was delivered within a few hours. And thereafter, counterattacks came in waves, the roar of the last mingling with the rush and fury of the next to break. Many companies lost all their officers. Enlisted men came forward as inspirational leaders to rally their battered companies into resisting yet one more onslaught. Our own artillery was brought to fall within 100 yards of our front line elements. After 5 hours, during which the earth never ceased to tremble, counterattacks ended, indicating that the withdrawal of the enemy's main body had commenced. In an effort to maintain contact, our patrols immediately pushed ahead. Entering the town, they discovered that San Pietro was ours for the taking. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions, less than a rifle company in strength, weary to death who were alive, stumbled forward past San Pietro to consolidate gains and reestablish contact with the enemy, now taking up new positions some 5 kilometers beyond. That is the broad shape of the Battle of San Pietro, which was but the first of many battles in Liri Valley. It was a very costly battle. After the battle, the 143rd Infantry Regiment alone required 1,100 replacements. The lives lost were precious lives. To their country, to their loved ones, and to the men themselves. For the living of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, more than 100 decorations for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. Many among these you see alive here have since joined the ranks of their brothers in arms who fell at San Pietro. For ahead lay San Vittore, and the Rapido River, and Cassino, and beyond Cassino, more rivers, and more mountains, and more towns, more San Pietros, greater or lesser, 1,000 more. As the battle passed over and beyond San Pietro, westward, townspeople began to appear, coming out of their caves in the mountains, where they had stayed in hiding during the enemy occupation. Mostly old people and children. Living was resumed in San Pietro. Children are able to forget quickly. Yesterday they wept. Today there are smiles and even laughter. Tomorrow it will be as though the bad things had never happened. Our prime military aim being to engage and defeat the enemy, the capture of the town itself and the liberation of its people is of an incidental nature. But the people, in their military innocence, look upon us solely as their deliverers. It was to free them and their farmlands that we came. Behind our lines, southwest to the sea, the fields are green with growing crops planted after our coming by other people of other towns who believe likewise. The new won earth of San Pietro was plowed and sown. It should yield a good harvest this year. And the people prayed to their patron saint to intercede with God in behalf of those who came, delivered them, and passed on to the north with the passing battle.
The end of the major phase of the most staggering war the world had ever known was greeted with wild acclaim in Moscow. The Russian people experienced a great surge of relief after 4 years of the most bitter and exhausting warfare. The great victory over Germany marked the start of a new era for the Soviets, an era of new importance for the Russian nation. When Soviet Russia accepted Nazi Germany's surrender at Berlin, She achieved a new peak position as a major world power. In that role, she would have a strong voice in the control of the world's affairs and play a decisive part in the attempt to forge a lasting peace.
The Western allies were invited and expected to participate in the signing at Berlin, but I felt it would be inappropriate for me personally to go. I thought the ratification in Berlin should be a Soviet affair. Consequently, I designated my deputy, Air Chief Marshal Tedder, to represent me at the ceremony.
The formal signing at Berlin was conducted 2 days after the surrender to the Allies at Reims, which officially ended the European phase of the war. The Russians, though represented at Reims, wanted an additional ritual.
Under the terms of the surrender document, the heads of the German armed services were required to appear in Berlin on May 9th to sign a ratification in the Russian headquarters. The second ceremony was, as we understood it, to give notice to the Germans and to the world that the surrender was made to all, not merely to the Western allies.
With the Russian commanders watching with deep satisfaction, Field Marshal General Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of the High Command, signed the surrender document, followed by Air Chief Marshal Tedder for the Western Allies and Marshal Zhukov for the Soviets. Less than a month later, representatives of the four victorious powers met in Berlin for the first formal session of the Allied Council for Control of Germany.
What permanence the new won peace might have, even what the future course of civilization would be, the answers to these questions now clearly involved, as an important factor, the ability of the East and West to work together and live together in one world.
The victory over the Nazis occasioned a continuing celebration. German soldiers were paraded ignominiously through the streets of Moscow under Red Army guard for the edification of the Russian people. The Russians took special delight in the humiliation of the defeated Nazi officers.
The experience of Russia in World War II was a harsh one. So many men, women, and children had been killed that the Russian government would never be able to estimate the total. The year 1941 saw the whole western portion of the country overrun by the Nazis. From the region of the Volga westward, almost everything was destroyed. All this would have embittered any people. It would have been completely astonishing if the Russians had not had a more direct and personal vindictiveness toward the Germans and a sterner attitude toward the realities of war than was the case in countries far removed from the scene of hostilities.
The Red Army, so badly underrated by the Nazi High Command at the time of Germany's treacherous attack on Russia, proved itself a magnificent fighting mechanism throughout 4 years of battle of staggering proportions. During the Russo-German War, the Red Army killed and captured an estimated 10 million Nazis in a series of overwhelming victories. But victories won at great expense.
The most costly... Marshal Zhukov and I frequently discussed the campaigns of the war. As far as I could see, he had given little concern to the methods that we considered vitally important to the maintenance of morale among American troops, systematic rotation of units, and, above all, development of techniques to avoid exposure of men to unnecessary battlefield risks, all of which, although common practice in our Army, seemed to be largely unknown in his. Even in their successful offensives, they paid a terrible price for victory. Great victories, the Russians seemed to think, inevitably required huge casualties. Because of Marshal Zhukov's special position for several years in the Red Army, he had had a longer experience as a responsible leader in great battles than any other man of our time. It seems that he was habitually sent to whatever Russian sector appeared at the moment to be the decisive one.
Many a German retreat was the result of Zhukov's strategy.
He agreed with me that destruction of enemy morale must always be the aim.
The basic differences between Russian and American attitudes in the conduct of the war was reflected in every aspect of combat against the Nazis. The Russians killed as many of the enemy as possible. And when they did take prisoners, the captured Nazis considered themselves much less fortunate than their brothers in arms who surrendered to the Western Allies.
It was not until the final months of the war that the Soviets began, in a military sense, to gain the great rewards paid for by their earlier severe sacrifices. Proud of their victories, the Russians always remembered with bitterness their cost. The extraordinary suffering of the population and the length of time that Russia endured the rigors and privations of battle combined to make the war on the Eastern Front one of the memorable sieges of history. On all sides, there was evidence of the destruction that Hitler's ruthless ambition had brought about. Every battle, every skirmish demanded its price in broken bodies and in the extinction of the lives of young Allied soldiers. I had a more sympathetic understanding of the Russian attitude than would have been possible before the beginning of the war.
At Yalta, in the Russian Crimea, in February 1945, the heads of government of the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Russia convened to discuss matters relating to joint administration, principally the post-war control of Germany.
In the past relations of America and Russia, there was no cause to regard the future with pessimism. Historically, the two peoples had maintained an unbroken friendship that dated back to the birth of the United States as an independent republic. Except for a short period, their diplomatic relations had been continuous. Both were free from the stigma of colonial empire building by force. Twice they had been allies in war. Since 1941, they had been dependent each on the other for ultimate victory over the European Axis. Ideologically, however, they were in diametric opposition. Out of this cleavage between the governmental systems of two great powers, there might develop in the world two hostile camps whose differences would ultimately provoke another Holocaust of war. Should the gulf, however, be bridged practically by effective methods of cooperation, the peace and unity of the world would be assured. No other division among the nations could be considered a menace to world unity and peace, provided mutual confidence and trust could be developed between America and the Soviets. Obstacles, doubts, fears of failure in American-Soviet relations were on every side. But the alternative to success seemed so terrifying to contemplate that all of us sought every possible avenue through which progress might be achieved.
Many Americans feel that our position in post-war Germany would be stronger today if the U.S. Army had been ordered to drive at full speed for Berlin. But the military considerations at the time made such a move unfeasible for the Supreme Commander.
When we stood on the Rhine in the last week of March 1945, we were 300 miles from Berlin, with the obstacle of the Elbe still 200 miles to our front. The Russian forces were firmly established only 30 miles from Berlin. For us to attempt to invest Berlin, I felt to be more than unwise. It was stupid.
As soon as the war in Europe had ended, the relations of the Western powers with the Russians became a matter of prime importance. In early August, General Eisenhower received an invitation from Moscow to visit the head of the Soviet government there. The general accepted promptly. Diplomatically, his visit was valuable as a goodwill gesture toward our Soviet ally. And like many other Americans, the general had a natural curiosity about Russia, its people, and its mode of life.
The Generalissimo suggested that a particular date to be included in my visit was August 12th, a day set aside for a national sports parade in Moscow. Just after we had arrived, the Generalissimo extended to me an invitation to join him on top of Lenin's tomb with two of my associates, provided I should like to do so. I was told the invitation was precedent-making. No other foreigner had ever been invited to set foot on top of Lenin's tomb. Realizing, therefore, that a special courtesy was intended, I quickly said that I would be happy indeed to accept. We stood for 5 hours on the tomb while the show went on. None of us had ever witnessed anything remotely similar. Every kind of folk dance, mass exercise, acrobatic feat, and athletic exhibition was executed with flawless precision. The sports parade was staged in the Red Square, a paved area of considerable acreage. Estimates as to the number of the performers varied between 20 and 50,000. I calculated that the lower figure was more nearly correct. Generalissimo showed no sign of fatigue. While we were watching the spectacle, he said, "This develops the war spirit. Your country ought to do more of this." And then he added, "We will never allow Germany to do this." I was pleased at this chance to see a country I had never before visited, but I was even more pleased by the implication that the Soviet government was as interested in developing friendly contacts as we were.
The war had left large sections of Russia in ruins. Soon after VE Day, the inhabitants of the cities and towns which had been demolished in the titanic struggle between the Red Army and the Nazi Wehrmacht began the slow process of rebuilding their communities. In Stalingrad, the people went about the task of building virtually a new city on the ruins of the old.
At that time, soon after VE Day, we saw no reason why the Russian system of government and democracy as practiced by the Western allies could not live side by side in the world, provided each respected the rights, the territory, and the convictions of the other, and each system avoided overt or covert action against the integrity of the other. Because implicit in Western democracy is respect for the rights of others, it seemed natural to us that this live and let live type of agreement could be achieved and honestly kept. That was probably the most for which we ever really hoped.
But although General Eisenhower found the daily life of the Russian people fairly similar to that of Americans, the reconciliation of the two ideologies was a far different matter, the general was convinced.
Marshal Zhukov seemed to be a firm believer in the communist concept. He said that we Americans induced a man to do things by telling him he might keep what he earned and might say what he pleased. In spite of my complete repudiation of the Marshal's contentions and my condemnation of all systems that involved dictatorship, there was no doubt in my mind that he was sincere.
With the wartime alliance receding into the pages of history, the Russian-American relationship grew steadily more troubled. The strain was most apparent in Germany, where Russian and American decisions on the administration of conquered Germany often clashed directly. Russia's blockade of Berlin, an attempt to cut off supplies for the city's western zones, came perilously close to precipitating a major crisis. This Soviet policy of belligerent bluffing was thwarted by the British and American airlift, which successfully ran the blockade for 11 months and finally forced the Russians to end it.
Several years of growing tension have shattered our dream of rapid progress toward universal peace and the elimination of armaments.
In the organizing conference of the United Nations at San Francisco, people all over the world saw new hope for international accord.
The democracies must learn that the world is now too small for the rigid concepts of national sovereignty that developed in a time when the nations were self-sufficient and self-dependent for their own well-being and safety. None of them today can stand alone. If the men and women of America face this issue as squarely and bravely as their soldiers faced the terrors of battle in World War II, we would have no fear of the outcome.
Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan, in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die. And we now together, dearest heart today.
For millions of Americans, from private to five-star general, their service in World War II forms the most memorable experience of their lifetime. This great global war, which consumed 6 years, took the lives of some 30 million people, both military and civilian. With ironic justice, Germany, the nation which precipitated the conflict, was left in ruins. The Allies paid an exorbitant price for victory. The lives of 13 million fighting men. This costly struggle, which overwhelmed the whole world, was instigated by one man. Early in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler began his quest for power with ostentatious displays of the growing might of his fanatical Nazi movement. The Führer hypnotized so many Germans into becoming his followers that the Nazis soon felt strong enough to challenge the world with impunity. Nazi troops pushed relentlessly across Europe. In only 9 months, they conquered 6 nations. But each new victory only whetted Hitler's appetite for more. On a Black Friday in June 1940, German troops marched into Paris, and the gay French capital turned quickly into a spiritless Nazi garrison town. With Germany now in control of the continent right to the sea, Hitler stepped up his air attacks on England. In the crucial battle for Britain, the steady, heavy pounding by the Luftwaffe was met by the courageous resistance of every Briton, from the average workman to Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
In December 1941, Japan helped crystallize America's feelings toward the war. There was no longer any uncertainty.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
It was decided to concentrate first on the Nazi enemy. Through the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, American ships carried a steady flow of men and materiel to England to prepare for battle with the Germans. In the waning days of autumn 1942, 1 million tons of shipping proceeded silently on the Atlantic toward Gibraltar in the first major Allied offensive against the Nazis. This was the greatest armada to sail into battle in history. Surprisingly, the convoys were not attacked during the crossing. The first Allied offensive consisted of simultaneous landings. No one could be sure of exactly what the French garrisons, under the command of Vichy France, would do by way of opposing the landings. On most of the beaches, the landings were lightly opposed. All 3 beachhead areas were soon secured. Allied units moved quickly forward against the Nazis to the east. For 6 months, Allied forces hammered continuously at the Nazi line in some of the most bitterly contested battles of the war. American GIs met their first real test in combat and came through in magnificent style. In the Libyan desert to the east of the Nazis, British 8th Army Tommies pounded the Nazi Africa Corps from the other side. Caught in a vice, the Germans were doomed. The 2 Allied forces pushed the remaining German troops into a smaller and smaller land area and finally succeeded in wiping the Nazis right off the African continent.
The only living Germans left in Tunisia were safely in our hands. The number of prisoners during the last week of the campaign alone reached 240,000. Included in these captures was all that was left of the Africa Corps and a number of other cracked German and Italian units.
The Allies celebrated their hard-fought victory in the streets of Tunis on May 20th, 1943. The next moves in the Allied strategy called for an invasion of Sicily, followed by landings on Italy itself. The first troops scheduled to land on European soil were American paratroopers, used on a larger scale than ever before in warfare.
Okay, I'm okay. I'm okay. We okay. We're okay. Everybody okay. Yeah!
Sicily was invaded by Allied forces on July 10th, 1943. And in 38 days, this key Mediterranean island was completely in Allied hands. The assault against the enemy on the European continent was to be made by Montgomery's forces across the Messina Strait, which separates Sicily from Italy. Farther north on the Italian coast at Salerno, the American 5th Army joined the attack less than a week later, and the Allied offensive gained momentum. The Italian campaign proved one of the toughest in the war. GIs had a stubbornly resisting enemy to contend with, plus very difficult terrain, disease, and miserable weather. In London in January 1944, General Eisenhower assumed the post of Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, and with his staff began planning at once for the major cross-channel invasion of the French coast. The plan called for the landing of 2 million Allied soldiers along the Normandy coast, followed by a quick breakout from the enemy's encircling positions. A supplementary invasion of the French Mediterranean coast was to be made by an Allied army group. The combined force was to surround and isolate the valuable Ruhr area and then drive deep into the heart of Germany to final victory over the remaining Nazi forces. The French coastal area was given a thorough softening up by Allied planes as the moment for the gigantic invasion drew near. Critical points in the rail and highway systems inland from the beaches were high priority targets. The great invasion force was ferried across the channel in more than 4,000 ships and small craft. Virtually every type of Allied assault vessel was included in the D-Day Armada, which carried 150,000 troops toward the invasion beaches. No enemy opposition was encountered in the crossing. As the fleet neared the Normandy coast on the morning of June 6th, Allied warships trained their guns on the German coastal defenses, and the battle for Europe was joined. The moment all the Allied world had prayed for was finally at hand. For some of the men in the assault force, this was their first taste of action.
Prepare to cast off!
The GIs in the landing boats realized that it was up to them. The Nazis, who had not expected an invasion at that exact time, massed their strength for a heavy counterblow. It looked as though the battle for the beaches about to begin would be a savage fight. It was a very tough fight. On Omaha Beach especially, the attacking units had a difficult time holding on to their limited beachhead. Any hopes for a fast, easy victory were quickly dispelled. On some of the beaches, invading forces had to cope with very heavy seas. Some of the boats were badly swamped. The men in them were in no condition at all to fight the Nazis. On June 7th, the day following the invasion, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. With the beachhead successfully secured, Allied forces pressed inland to keep the Nazis off balance. The drive through the French coastal provinces was accompanied by some very heavy fighting. On every section of the front, the GIs pounded at the Nazi line without let-up. Less than 12 weeks after the invasion of the Normandy beaches, Allied fighting forces entered Paris. The city was immediately restored officially to French authority. The arrival of the French 2nd Division, bent on wiping out the remains of the Nazi garrison, prompted an outburst of wild rejoicing by the Parisians. 2 days later, General Eisenhower, accompanied by General Bradley and Air Chief Marshal Tedder, entered the city quietly, but attracted such a crowd that they were forced to leave at once.
I promised that 2 of our divisions would march to the front through the main avenues of the city. I declined personally to be present at this formation, but indicated that General Bradley would stand the review to symbolize Allied unity.
Supplemented by the army group which invaded southern France, the Allies took up the pursuit of the Nazis across eastern France and up to the borders of Germany itself.
We were certain that by continuing an unremitting offensive, we would, in spite of hardship and privation, gain additional advantages over the enemy.
But the Germans were not quite through. In December 1944, Hitler planned a single, powerful counteroffensive at one spot in the Allied line, in the Ardennes sector. It was a staggering blow. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Nazis employed 3 armies totaling some 14 infantry and 10 panzer divisions. They drove head-on into the Allied position. Late in December, the Allies counterattacked, with the 3rd Army assaulting from the south and later the 1st Army from the north. By early January, the exhausting process of pushing the enemy back to his former line began. Additional reserves were brought up to strengthen the new Allied offensive, which hammered the retreating Nazis continuously. In miserable fighting weather, the Allies pressed forward and finally succeeded in closing the gap about 1 month after the Germans started their assault. With the Battle of the Bulge ended, the Allies continued the attack against the reeling Nazi armies. The Germans lost great quantities of valuable material in the month-long battle, equipment they would not soon be able to replace. More important still, the enemy suffered some 120,000 casualties. One of the most formidable military obstacles in the path of the Allied armies was the Rhine River. Crossings were made at a number of points against determined opposition. To General Eisenhower, the crossing of the Rhine was one of the most important steps in the hastening of the Nazis' final defeat.
We received a series of encouraging reports. Everywhere, the landings appeared completely successful.
Supplementing the amphibious assaults across the river was an attack the following morning by 2 airborne divisions, including paratroopers and GIs transported in gliders.
This was the most successful airborne operation we carried out during the war.
The ground forces which made the assaults quickly established a foothold on the eastern bank of the river and proceeded without pause to drive deeper into the heart of Germany.
The Prime Minister undoubtedly derived an intense satisfaction from putting his foot on the eastern bank of Germany's traditional barrier. Possibly he felt the act was symbolic of the final defeat of an enemy who had forced Britons back to the wall 5 years before.
During the following weeks, the Allied offensive picked up speed in its crushing advance across Germany. Numbers of GIs who had been captured by the Germans in earlier battles were liberated along the way. Just 7 weeks after the first Rhine crossing, American GIs met Russian soldiers at the Elbe.
It seemed fitting that 5th Corps troops, among those who had made the initial assault on the Normandy beaches, should be first to make contact with the Red Army.
In Berlin, the Russians were engaged in the savage battle for the city with the last-ditch Nazi defenders. Russian troops under the command of Marshal Zhukov penetrated deep into the German capital. The last of the Nazis surrendered to the Russians on May 3rd. The futile defense of Berlin had cost the Germans an estimated 500,000 killed and captured. After 4 exhausting years in which the Nazis had been beaten off in a series of epic battles, the Russians had won Berlin. The Nazis gave up formally in several areas. At Lüneburg Heath on May 4th, they surrendered their northern forces to the Allies, represented by Field Marshal Montgomery.
Now, I will sign the instrument on behalf of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower.
Complete Nazi capitulation came on May 7th at Reims, when the Nazi High Command, represented by Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's trusted lieutenant, surrendered to all the Allied nations with General Walter Bedell Smith acting for the United States. The major phase of the greatest war in history was ended.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. This unconditional surrender has been achieved by teamwork. Teamwork not only among all the allies participating, but among all the services, land, sea, and air. To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid. The only repayment that can be made to them is a deep appreciation and lasting gratitude of all free citizens of all the United Nations.